In this video, we are going to take a look at the topic 6.12, the default arguments. Default parameter is used when we call the function without the parameters. Here is one example function prototype with default arguments. Usually when we declare the function prototype, we use just the data type without any particular values. In this example, when we declare the function prototype, we use the particular values 10 for each parameters. It means that when we call this function without arguments values, the default value 10 will be assigned to the parameter. Let's take a look at marked point number 1. At this point, we call the function with arguments value 20 and 30. So these values are passed to the function, and 20 and 30 are assigned for the parameter values for the function. At the second point, marked number 2, we call the function with arguments 50. Actually, this function was supposed to have 2 parameter values, but we give just 1 argument when we call this function. In this case, the second parameter will be assigned with the default argument. At the point number 3, we call the function without any arguments. Hence, the function has default values for all parameters. Let's summarize this slide. When we declare the function prototype with default arguments, and we call the function without arguments, the default value will be assigned to the parameter values of the function. If you give part of them for the arguments, the rest of them will be assigned with the default argument values. Let's take a look at another example. If you don't have the function prototype because the function body is declared before the main function, in this case we can give default arguments in function header. In this slide, we are going to show an example when we give the part of default arguments. When an argument is left out of a function call, all arguments that come after it must be left out as well. In the first example, we call the function with just 1 argument. In this case, the second argument will be default value 10. The second example causes an error, because we call the function where the first argument is default and second argument is the given number. Once you give the default arguments, the rest of them must be the default arguments. And also, it is possible for function to have some parameters with default arguments. In this example, we give just only 1 default parameters for the second one. If you want to make the function prototype with default parameters, all the default parameter must be defined at last. Otherwise, it causes an error. In this case, we declare the default arguments for the first one and second one is not, but we cannot make the declaration like that. If you want to make the default parameters for part of them, all default parameters must be defined last. In this slide, I will give 3 basic rules for the default arguments. First rule is about the value of default arguments. All the value of default arguments must be a real value or named constant. The second rule is related with the partial default arguments. If you want to call the function with the default parameter, once you give the default arguments, all the arguments that come after it must be default arguments. The third rule is also related with the partial default arguments. When a function has a mixture of parameters both with and without default arguments, the parameter with the default arguments must be declared last. In this example, the first parameter is the default parameter and second one is not, so it causes errors. If you want to make the partial default arguments, all the default parameter definition must be declared last. These are simple basic rules for default arguments. Now let's move on next slide. The next slide is Programming Lab. This Programming Lab 6-6 is the same as the 6-1 except the default arguments. 6-1 is the program that finds the prime numbers with the given user range. We are going to make the function definition with the default arguments. The first default argument is 0 and second default argument value is 100. When we have the invalid user inputs, we are going to call the function with the default arguments. We have two invalid user range cases. The first case is the begin point is the same as the end point. In this case, we call the function with the default arguments. The second argument will be the default argument. If the beginning point is greater than end point, it is also invalid user range. In this case, we call the function as both arguments are default values. The last case is the valid user input. In this case, we call the function without default arguments. Here is the program outline. We have two functions. The first function is input valid. This function is to check the user ranges. According to these values, we call the function getListPrime with default value or without default values.